The sky over Maple Ridge Acres was still glowing orange when I ran from my barn to the edge of my cornfield. Smoke curled through the evening air, thick and acrid, clinging to my throat. My heart pounded. This wasn't a simple brush fire. This was my harvest, months of sweat and work, going up in flames. I could hear the crackle of dry stalks collapsing in the heat and the faint wail of sirens in the distance. Whoever had started this didn't just ruin a crop, they lit a match to my entire livelihood. Neighbors gathered at the fence line, whispering, eyes wide. And that's when I saw her. Karen. The self-appointed queen of the HOA, arms folded, lips pinched tight like she was the victim here. This is the same woman who'd complained about unsightly farm equipment, who'd filed noise complaints about my tractor at dawn, who'd once tried to fine me for unapproved crop height. Now she stood watching the fire spread, her phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip. She didn't call for help. She just watched. The fire truck screamed down the road and jolted to a stop. Firefighters leapt out, hauling hoses, shouting commands, cutting through the smoke. They worked fast, but the field was already a blackened scar. One of them turned to me and asked if I knew who might have caused it. Before I could answer, a gust of wind sent sparks flying toward the neighborhood greenbelt. The captain barked orders, and that's when Karen panicked. Her face drained of color. She started waving her arms, yelling at the firefighters not to spray near her pristine white fence, begging them to save her hydrangeas. The same woman who'd threatened to report me for environmental hazards was now begging for help as embers floated onto her perfectly manicured lawn. The firefighters ignored her shrieks and pushed past, dousing the edges before the flames could leap onto her property. I stood there, soot on my clothes, watching her facade crack. Neighbors were whispering louder now. They'd all heard her endless complaints. Some of them knew she'd been furious when the HOA lost its bid to stop me from expanding the cornfield. And when a firefighter asked who might have had a grudge, more than one head turned her way. Karen sputtered, claiming she'd been inside all evening, that she smelled something funny, and came out to help. But her story didn't match the fact that someone had spotted her car creeping along the field earlier that night. And when the fire chief asked to see her security camera footage, she suddenly couldn't remember her password. The night dragged on as the fire crews soaked the last smoldering rose. My crop was gone, but the real show was just beginning. Neighbors started pulling out their phones, recording everything. Karen pacing, stammering, her perfect HOA composure unraveling. The fire chief quietly took notes, his flashlight beam catching the glint of something metallic near the charred fence line. It looked suspiciously like the kind of lighter you'd find in a gas station aisle. I could feel the shift in the crowd, the way suspicion moved like a current. Karen's voice grew shrill as she insisted someone else must have done this. Maybe those teenagers she always blamed for every bent mailbox. But no one seemed to buy it. Even her closest HOA allies stepped back, unwilling to stand beside her as the questions piled up. And as the firefighters wrapped up, the chief made a call on his radio that silenced the murmurs. Whatever he'd found out there, it wasn't just a random spark. 2 patrol cars eased down the gravel drive, red and blue lights cutting through the haze. The neighbors shifted uneasily as the sheriff's deputies stepped out, their boots crunching over the blackened soil. One of them, a tall officer with a calm, steady voice, walked straight toward Karen. He didn't look at anyone else, didn't even glance at me. Karen's chin lifted like she was ready to lecture them on HOA bylaws, but the officer's tone sliced right through her practiced smile. He asked where she'd been between sunset and the first 911 call. Her answer came too quick, too rehearsed. Inside, of course. I was baking bread. The crowd stirred. Everyone knew Karen couldn't cook to save her life. She bragged about ordering meal kits because ovens were messy. The deputy raised an eyebrow, then held up a small evidence bag. Inside was a lighter, blackened at the edges. My stomach dropped. He explained it had been found near the point of origin, along with fresh footprints leading back toward the cul-de-sac. Size 7. Karen's size. A neighbor gasped. Another whispered, "That's her shoe size, I lent her boots last winter." Karen's voice went high and brittle. She accused me of planting the lighter. She accused teenagers, drifters, anyone but herself. But the deputy calmly pointed out the fresh soot streaks on her hands, faint but visible under the glow of the patrol lights. She tried to hide them behind her cardigan, but the damage was done. Meanwhile, the fire chief returned from his truck holding a printout of call logs. "Funny thing," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "We received an anonymous call about a planned burn on this property, from a blocked number that traced back to a phone registered at your address, ma'am." The neighbors gasped in unison. Karen froze, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's. The officers didn't cuff her, not yet, but they stepped closer, their presence heavy. One of them began taking photos of her hands, her shoes, the singe marks on the hem of her expensive jacket. The murmurs turned into an audible buzz as people started recording on their phones. Every HOA board member who'd once backed Karen was now standing a safe few feet away, their faces pale in the rotating lights. I stood silent, the smell of smoke clinging to my clothes, watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion movie. Months of hard work had turned to ash behind me, but the tide of sympathy was shifting. Neighbors who'd complained about tractor noise earlier were suddenly at my side, offering words of support, handing me bottles of water. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to regain control, threatening lawsuits, claiming harassment, insisting she'd never even touched a lighter in her life. But the sheriff only nodded to his deputy, who quietly read her the local fire ordinance. Every violation, every penalty. The numbers made a few people whistle under their breath. Even without arson charges, the fines alone could gut her savings. And then, from the corner of the crowd, old Mr. Delgado, the one neighbor Karen hated most, stepped forward holding his phone. He'd been recording long before the flames reached their peak. He pressed play, and through the crackle of fire came a shaky but unmistakable video. Karen's silhouette near the fence line, the flick of a lighter, and a spark igniting dry corn husks. The crowd went silent. The only sounds were the distant hiss of cooling embers and the soft click of the deputy's pen as he noted the time. Karen's breath hitched as the video played a second time, the faint glow of the screen throwing her panicked face into sharp relief. She lunged forward, snatching at Mr. Delgado's phone, but the deputy stepped between them with a quiet firmness that made the crowd collectively inhale. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stay right where you are," he said, his voice low but commanding. Karen froze, her outstretched hand trembling midair before she slowly pulled it back. The once confident HOA president looked suddenly small against the backdrop of flashing lights and charred corn stalks. The sheriff took the phone, studied the footage, and nodded. "This matches the footprints and lighter placement," he said evenly. "We'll need to secure this as evidence." He turned to Karen, his expression unreadable. "You're not under arrest at this moment, but you are now a person of interest in an active investigation. I strongly advise you to cooperate." Murmurs rippled through the neighbors like a gust of wind through dry leaves. A few people quietly stepped away from Karen, as if the smoke itself had turned toxic around her. Someone whispered, "She always said the crops were lowering our property values," and another answered, "Guess we know how far she'd go." Karen's carefully built image, weekly newsletters, perfect hedges, endless HOA rules, was unraveling with every passing second. She opened her mouth to protest, but only a strangled sound came out. The deputy gently guided her toward the patrol car, not in cuffs, but with the quiet insistence of someone who wouldn't take no for an answer. I watched in a daze as neighbors began to rally around me. Mrs. Carter from 3 houses down pressed a hand on my shoulder and said, "We've got photos of her car near the field earlier. We'll share them with the sheriff." Others nodded, offering their own bits of evidence. Snapshots, messages, small moments they'd brushed aside until tonight. The fire chief returned from his inspection of the far edge of the field, carrying a blackened piece of cloth. "Found this snagged on the fence," he said. Even through the soot, the distinctive HOA logo from one of their event jackets was visible. Gasps echoed again. Karen owned a jacket exactly like it. She'd worn it to every monthly meeting. Karen's voice finally broke through, shaky and uneven. You don't understand," she stammered. "I was trying to scare him. Just a small fire. I thought it would burn out." She caught herself, eyes widening as she realized what she'd admitted. The sheriff's head tilted slightly, and the deputy calmly noted her words in his pad. Cameras and phones caught every second. Around us, the night seemed to grow quieter, the last hiss of embers fading while the weight of her confession settled over the crowd. I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. My crop was gone, yes, but the truth, undeniable, documented truth, was now out in the open. Karen's reign over Maple Ridge Acres had finally met something she couldn't bully or fine into silence. The deputy glanced toward the sheriff, who gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Karen's shoulders sagged as if she understood exactly what that meant. The sheriff stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ash. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "for the safety of this neighborhood and to preserve the integrity of the investigation, I need you to come with us for questioning." Karen's knees seemed to buckle. She grabbed the patrol car's doorframe for balance, the HOA jacket slipping from her shoulders and landing in the blackened soil. The pristine white fabric now streaked with soot looked like a fallen flag of surrender. Neighbors watched in tense silence. No one moved to help her. She opened her mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to beg, but only a thin rasp came out. The deputy gently but firmly guided her into the back seat. The car's interior light flared for a moment, casting her face in a harsh glow. The same woman who once dictated the color of everyone's mailbox now sat trembling, hair disheveled, eyes darting wildly at the circle of neighbors recording every second. As the door clicked shut, a low murmur spread through the crowd. Phones lowered. People exchanged glances, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Someone whispered, "It's over." Another answered, "Not for her." The fire chief approached me, clipboard in hand. "We'll need a formal statement," he said, voice softened now that the immediate danger had passed. Behind him, the last fire truck sprayed a fine mist over the smoldering earth, turning the blackened soil into dark mud. I nodded, the smell of wet ash and charred corn heavy in the air. Months of work lay ruined, but the strange calm of closure began to settle over me. Neighbors drifted closer, people who'd never said more than a polite hello before tonight. Mrs. Carter offered to help organize a fundraiser. The Delgados said they'd bring over dinner tomorrow. Even quiet Mr. Reeves, who once filed a noise complaint about my tractor, placed a hand on my shoulder and muttered, "We'll help you replant." The sheriff lingered nearby, speaking softly into his radio. I caught fragments of words: evidence secured, arson investigation, district attorney. Each phrase felt like a small weight lifting, proof that this wouldn't be brushed aside as a petty neighborhood dispute. I turned back toward the field, the moonlight glinting off the damp remnants of what had been a golden harvest. Smoke still rose in thin, ghostly columns, carrying with it the smell of betrayal. But beneath that scent was something else, a faint, stubborn hint of earth and life, as if the soil itself refused to quit. Behind me, the sheriff ended his call and approached once more, his tone quiet but firm. "We'll keep you updated as this moves forward," he said. "You did the right thing staying calm tonight. It made all the difference." I thanked him, though the words felt small against the night's chaos. The crowd had thinned, but a handful of neighbors remained, watching the patrol car's taillights fade down the lane. In the hush that followed, the only sounds were the drip of water from the hoses and the faint crackle of dying embers. I stood there a long moment, the cool night air settling over the scorched field, knowing this was far from finished. An investigation, a court case, a long road ahead, but also knowing the truth had finally stepped into the light, and there would be no going back. The sheriff's cruiser disappeared around the bend, leaving the night strangely quiet. A faint mist hung low over the blackened field, the smell of wet ash mixing with the sharp scent of corn stalks that would never see harvest. I exhaled slowly, the first real breath I'd taken in hours, while the remaining neighbors shifted closer, their faces lit by the glow of phone screens and lingering firelight. Mr. Delgado cleared his throat. "We'll need to meet tomorrow," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something like resolve. "The HOA board has to address this. She won't, hold that seat after tonight." Heads nodded all around. People who'd once whispered their grievances about Karen now spoke openly, their voices gaining confidence as the adrenaline faded. I noticed the faint crunch of boots behind me and turned to see a firefighter kneeling near the scorched fence line. He held a small metal canister wrapped in a charred rag. "Likely an accelerant container," he murmured to the fire chief, who jotted a note without looking up. The evidence bag sealed with a crisp snap, a sound that seemed to punctuate the night. Mrs. Carter approached with a thermos of coffee she'd fetched from her kitchen. "You're not standing out here alone," she said firmly, pressing the warm metal into my soot-streaked hands. The simple gesture cut through the heaviness, and for the first time I realized how cold the night had become. The sheriff returned from a brief call, his face unreadable but his tone reassuring. "The district attorney's office will review everything first thing in the morning," he said. "Between the video, her statement, and the accelerant, the case is strong." He paused, scanning the field. "Your insurance company will want photos before cleanup. We'll have our own investigators here at sunrise." Neighbors began quietly organizing themselves. Someone offered to bring a generator for lights, another suggested a group cleanup to salvage what they could. Even the teenagers Karen had so often blamed for every minor mishap stepped forward, asking where they could help. I walked a few paces into the field, the mud squelching beneath my boots. In the moonlight, the soil steamed faintly, still alive beneath the ruin. Despite the devastation, I felt a stubborn spark of determination. This land had fed generations before me and it would rise again. Behind me, the group grew smaller as families drifted home, but their parting words carried across the dark. Promises of labor, equipment, meals, and testimony. The community Karen had tried to fracture was knitting itself back together right in front of me, bound now by something stronger than HOA bylaws. The fire chief gave a final nod. "We'll be back at first light," he said, climbing into his truck. The last engine rumbled away, leaving only the rhythmic drip of water and the quiet hum of crickets returning to the night. I stood at the edge of the ruined crop, coffee warming my hands, the horizon just beginning to pale with the first hint of dawn. The fight wasn't over. Legal battles, insurance claims, endless paperwork lay ahead, but for the first time in months, maybe years, I wasn't facing it alone. A pale stripe of silver stretched across the horizon as dawn began to push back the night. The air carried that raw, earthy scent you only smell after a fire, the mix of damp soil, smoke, and something almost metallic. I sipped the last of the coffee Mrs. Carter had given me, the warmth cutting through the chill that clung to my clothes. A single pair of headlights crept up the lane. It wasn't another patrol car this time but the local news van, the station's logo barely visible through the early fog. They must have caught the story overnight. The reporter stepped out, microphone in hand, eyes widening as she took in the scorched field behind me. She didn't even need to ask. The smell of gasoline and the sight of blackened corn told its own story. Before she could speak, the sheriff emerged from his own vehicle. He'd stayed nearby, monitoring everything. "Morning," he said, voice low but steady. "We'll keep this brief. Evidence techs are on their way. We'll need you to walk us through the perimeter again once they arrive." His eyes flicked toward the news crew. "And keep details tight for now. This is an active case." The reporter nodded respectfully, staying back but snapping quick photos. Neighbors began to reappear, one by one, drawn by the rising sun and the scent of wet ash. Mr. Reeves carried a tray of pastries. The Delgado kids brought bottled water and gloves, ready to start clearing debris. Even the teenagers Karen had often accused of mischief were there, shoulders squared, silent but determined to help. A low rumble announced the arrival of the forensic truck. 2 investigators stepped out, carrying cameras and evidence kits. They moved with quiet precision, photographing every footprint, every scorched stalk, every glint of melted plastic. One paused near the fence line, pointing out a set of tire tracks that curved suspiciously close to the origin point of the blaze. The sheriff crouched to inspect them. "Same tread pattern as the HOA-issued vehicle," he muttered to his deputy. The words carried just enough for those nearest to hear, and a ripple of recognition moved through the group. Karen's HOA golf cart, the one she drove on her nightly patrols, used tires just like that. I felt a fresh surge of anger but also a grim sense of closure. Each new piece of evidence tightened the circle around her. No rumors, no denials, just facts stacking higher by the minute. As the sun climbed, shafts of light broke through the thinning smoke, casting long shadows across the blackened rows. In that light, the field looked less like ruin and more like a blank canvas. Neighbors began staking out areas to clear, marking spots where the soil could be tilled again. Someone suggested a community replanting day. Another offered spare seed. The determination in their voices was stronger than any single act of sabotage. I stood a moment longer at the edge of the field, the charred earth warm beneath my boots, and realized the night had done more than burn my harvest. It had burned away the isolation Karen had tried to build around me. The land could be replanted. The community was already regrowing, right here in the morning light. The sun finally broke free of the horizon, washing the field in a soft gold that almost hid the black scars of the fire. A gentle breeze carried the smell of damp earth instead of smoke now, a small mercy after the night's chaos. I tightened my jacket and walked deeper into the field, boots sinking slightly where the hoses had soaked the soil. Behind me, the forensic team worked methodically. Their cameras clicked like steady metronomes while they collected samples of soil, ash, and the melted fragments of what looked like plastic gas can caps. Each bag was labeled with the careful precision of people who knew a case was building with every scoop. Neighbors moved like quiet helpers in the background. Mrs. Carter handed out gloves and trash bags. Mr. Delgado organized a group to gather fallen stalks that could be composted. Even the teenagers Karen once accused of vandalism were lifting scorched debris into wheelbarrows without a word. The field, though scarred, buzzed with determined life. The sheriff approached again, his expression thoughtful. "The DA's office already called," he said. "They'll fast-track the arson charges. Between the video, her confession slip, and the accelerant evidence, it's strong." He paused, lowering his voice. "We'll also recommend restitution. She'll be responsible for damages if the court agrees." Restitution. The word settled over me like a slow, unexpected relief. It wouldn't bring back the lost crop, but it meant the season wasn't entirely gone. Insurance, fines, and now the possibility of Karen herself paying for what she destroyed, each was another step toward rebuilding. A sudden crunch of gravel drew my eyes to the driveway. More neighbors were arriving, families with work gloves, a local mechanic with a trailer, even a nearby farmer bringing a small tractor to help turn the soil when the investigators cleared the scene. The same people Karen had tried to divide were now united, stronger than her rules had ever allowed. I walked to the center of the field and knelt, running my hand through the warm, damp soil. Beneath the blackened top layer, the earth was rich and dark, ready to heal. Life was still here waiting. When I stood, the sheriff was waiting with a clipboard for my formal statement. His deputy held out a camera to photograph the boundary markers I'd set months ago. As I began to recount every detail, the first wisp of smoke, the sight of Karen in the glow, the firefighters arriving, I felt the weight of the night shift from panic to record, from chaos to evidence. Overhead, a hawk circled lazily in the brightening sky, its shadow gliding across the field like a promise. The land would recover. The truth was already rooted deep. And though this fight wasn't finished, the day had finally begun. The sheriff listened without interrupting as I finished my statement, his pen scratching a final note before he closed the clipboard with a firm snap. "That lines up with what we've gathered so far," he said. "You'll get a copy for your records, and the DA will likely contact you within a few days." His eyes softened. "You did everything right last night." Not many people stay that calm when their livelihood's on fire. I nodded, though the compliment felt heavy. Calm hadn't come easy, it had been a choice every second of the night, a grip on something steady while everything I'd built turned to smoke. As the forensic team wrapped up, the local news reporter approached with cautious steps. "I know this is still unfolding," she said, microphone lowered, "but would you like to share anything for the morning broadcast?" Her cameraman stood ready, the red light blinking. I looked past her at the field, rows of charred stalks, glistening with dew in the early light. "Tell them," I said slowly, "that one person tried to burn this place down, but everyone else came to build it back up. That's the story." The cameraman recorded my words with a quiet nod. Around us, the sound of rebuilding had already started. The nearby farmer fired up his small tractor, its low rumble mixing with the clink of shovels and the scrape of wheelbarrows. Children carried buckets of ash to a growing compost pile. The teenagers who'd been blamed for every minor prank worked shoulder to shoulder with retirees, clearing debris in a steady rhythm. Mrs. Carter handed me a folded piece of paper, a list of neighbors volunteering for a replanting day next weekend. "We'll get seeds, tools, whatever it takes," she said. "This field won't stay empty for long." The sheriff's radio crackled with a brief update from the station. He listened, then gave a short nod. "Karen's being processed now," he said quietly. "Arson charges are moving forward. With the evidence we've got, the case will hold." I exhaled, the first true breath of the morning. The sky was a clear blue now, streaked with the soft pink of sunrise. The field no longer looked like a crime scene, it looked like ground ready for new roots. The news van rolled away, its tires crunching over gravel, leaving behind the hum of real work. Neighbors kept arriving, some with food, others with tools. The field that had felt like a graveyard hours ago now pulsed with purpose, a living thing even in its scars. I stepped forward into the damp soil, the black ash giving way to the rich earth beneath. My boots sank slightly, but the ground held firm, steady underfoot. Whatever came next, court dates, insurance battles, endless paperwork, the day's first light proved one thing: this land and the people around it were not so easily burned away. By mid-morning the field hummed with a quiet, determined energy. The earlier tension had melted into the steady rhythm of work, rakes scraping, wheelbarrows creaking, the low rumble of the neighbor's tractor turning the blackened soil. Birds that had fled the smoke returned in cautious flutters, their calls threading through the sound of shovels and boots. The forensic team packed up their final evidence bags and gave a brief nod. "Scene's cleared for cleanup," one of them said, sliding the last labeled envelope into a metal case. "You can start reworking the ground whenever you're ready. We'll be in touch if we need follow-up." Their departure felt like the closing of a chapter, but not the end of the story. I thanked them and walked the boundary of the field with a slow, deliberate step. The charred rows looked brutal in the bright sunlight, yet beneath each black strip the soil still smelled alive, rich and damp, stubbornly fertile. I knelt to scoop a handful, letting it crumble between my fingers. Beneath the ash, it was already soft and dark again, as if ready to erase the night's violence. At the gate, Mrs. Carter and Mr. Delgado organized a list of tasks on a scrap of cardboard. "We'll restake the irrigation lines this afternoon," Mrs. Carter said, her voice brisk but encouraging. "If we can get seed orders in by evening, we'll be ready to plant as soon as the ground's turned." Heads nodded all around. A pickup rumbled into the driveway and out stepped the county agriculture agent, clipboard in hand. He gave a low whistle at the sight of the burned acres but smiled when he spotted the neighbors working. "You've got half the town out here," he said. "That's a good start. We'll fast-track soil testing so you can replant without delay. And the emergency fund for farm losses should cover a chunk of the damage." His words were practical but they landed like a promise. This wasn't just recovery, it was momentum. From the porch of my farmhouse, the reporter I'd spoken to earlier filmed a second segment, this time capturing the growing crew of volunteers. Her voice carried across the yard. A community once divided by HOA disputes now united to restore what one person tried to destroy. The camera panned across children carrying buckets, elders leaning on rakes, and neighbors who'd barely spoken to each other before last night now working side by side. I took a deep breath, the morning air crisp and clean at last. The fear and smoke of the night felt distant, replaced by the grounded certainty of hands in soil and plans taking shape. The legal battle ahead would be long, but the land, and the people who stood on it, were already moving forward, row by row, step by step, toward something stronger than before. By early afternoon the charred rows were almost unrecognizable. Freshly turned soil stretched in long dark ribbons where the tractor had passed, the heavy scent of earth replacing the acrid bite of smoke. Every few yards, small piles of burnt stalks marked what was left of the harvest, but the field already felt alive again, as if it refused to stay a monument to the night's destruction. The county agriculture agent moved methodically along the edges, driving slender stakes to mark where test samples had been pulled. "The nutrient levels look better than expected," he called over the engine's low rumble. "This ground can take seed again as soon as you're ready." His words sent a ripple of quiet excitement through the volunteers. Neighbors worked in steady teams. Teenagers hauled ash buckets to a growing compost mound. The Delgados trimmed broken fence posts while Mrs. Carter coordinated deliveries of seed and irrigation parts on her phone. Conversations that once would have been curt or non-existent flowed easily now, punctuated by the scrape of shovels and the occasional laugh when someone unearthed an old tool or a stone shaped like a heart. I paused at the center of the field, wiping soot from my hands. The farmhouse stood at the far edge, its white siding smudged gray from drifting smoke but solid and bright against the blue sky. I thought about the night before, the frantic glow of flames, the sirens, Karen's frantic denials, and the contrast felt almost surreal. A car door slammed near the road. I turned to see another neighbor I barely knew stepping out, arms full of seed packets. "Figured you'd need these," he said simply, setting them on a makeshift table by the fence. Behind him, more vehicles slowed, drivers leaning out to offer tools, hoses, even a spare tiller. Each arrival added to the quiet sense of momentum, the certainty that this land would be green again soon. The sheriff returned in the late afternoon, dust trailing his cruiser. He gave a small wave before crossing the field to where I stood. "Quick update," he said, lowering his voice. "Karen's arraignment is scheduled for Monday. The DA's office is confident. Your insurance adjuster will meet you here tomorrow morning." I thanked him, though words felt almost unnecessary now. The legal storm was gathering elsewhere. Here, the day belonged to the soil and the people tending it. As the sun began to dip, long golden beams cut across the field, catching motes of dust that shimmered like tiny sparks. Volunteers leaned on their rakes, pausing to drink water and admire the rows of newly turned earth. What had been a blackened scar only hours earlier now looked like the first draft of a new season, raw, ready, and undeniably alive. I took one last look at the horizon, the sky streaked with orange and violet, and felt the ground steady beneath my boots. The fight wasn't over, courts, insurance, rebuilding, but the land had already chosen its next chapter, and together we were writing it line by line, furrow by furrow, with every shovelful of dark, forgiving soil. Evening settled slowly, draping the fields in a soft copper glow. A thin crescent moon appeared over the treeline while the last tractor passes carved neat ridges through the freshly turned soil. The air was cool now, carrying the rich scent of earth and the faint sweetness of corn husks buried deep beneath the surface. Clusters of neighbors lingered near the fence, their laughter low and easy after a long day's work. Someone strung a few lanterns between fence posts, their warm light flickering against faces streaked with dirt and sweat. It felt less like a cleanup and more like a quiet harvest festival, one born not of crops but of stubborn unity. I walked the length of the field with Mr. Delgado, the lanterns casting long shadows across the rows. You'll have seedlings in here before you know it, he said, nudging a clump of soil with his boot. And when that first green shows, we'll all be here to see it. At the farmhouse porch, Mrs. Carter poured coffee into chipped mugs while the teenagers passed out sandwiches. A cooler popped open with a hiss, and the sound drew a cheer from the workers who'd stayed until the very last rake of the day. The sheriff's cruiser returned once more, headlights cutting a slow arc along the drive. He stepped out with a brief nod, clearly off duty now. Just wanted to check in before heading home, he said. Karen's attorney tried to reach a quick settlement, but the DA isn't interested. The case will move forward. He paused, taking in the sight of the lantern-lit field, and the neighbors gathered in quiet celebration. Looks like you're already ahead of her, though. I glanced across the rows, dark soil glistening in the lantern light, a patchwork of hard work and fresh beginnings. This was never just about one person, I said. It's about everyone who decided not to let one night define this land. The sheriff gave a small smile and tipped his hat before heading back to his car. As his taillights disappeared, the night grew still except for the gentle murmur of voices and the distant call of an owl. I stepped onto the porch, mug in hand, and watched as neighbors slowly drifted toward home. Some left promises to return at sunrise, others pressed my shoulder in quiet solidarity before slipping into the darkness. When the last lantern was dimmed, only the moonlight remained, silvering the newly turned earth. I stood there alone for a moment, breathing in the night air. The field, scarred, reborn, and waiting, stretched out before me, a quiet testament to everything that had survived the flames. And that's where we leave it tonight. One burned field, a mountain of ash, but a community that refused to let destruction have the last word. Karen will face the courts, but the soil already carries the promise of a new harvest, stronger than before. If this story moved you, hit like, share it with a friend who needs a reminder that neighbors can still stand together, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter as the season, and the fight for justice, continues. Until then, stay safe, stay grounded, and remember, a single spark can burn, but it can also light the way forward.